So Pastor, I wasn't sure if I heard.
It is most important to teach others as family members to be a reflection of Jesus. But if your family member is going out wearing something crazy, you can still tell them that. Yeah. The one doesn't preclude the other. Help them out. Help a brother or sister out. Why didn't Jesus know when the world would end and he would return? Why didn't Jesus know his own return date? Mark 13. Turn there with me. Mark 13. We're in a series entitled The Hard Sayings of Jesus. And remember I said the saying of Jesus may be hard because it's hard to understand, or it may be hard because it's just a hard truth to have to swallow. Sometimes it's both. And so the problem is set out in Mark 13. There's something that Jesus says he does not know. So is Jesus the God-man? Because in order to save us, he must be both. In order to come to us and teach us, he must be both. It's God's plan that Jesus be both, the God-man. So as we look at Jesus not knowing something, we have to ask ourselves, well, if there's something that he doesn't know, can he still be God? Because one of the things we say about God is all-knowing or omniscient. He knows everything. He knows the end from the beginning. He knows all things that have ever happened and will ever happen. So is Jesus the God-man? We've got a problem right here in Mark 13. As we begin Mark 13 in verses 1 and 2, it says, as Jesus came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus tells them rightly, verse 2, that not one of the stones in the temple will be left standing upon another. He predicts in about 37 years the temple will be torn down. And it happened by AD 70. So within 37 years, Jesus tells them this temple will be completely destroyed. So Jesus clearly spoke a prophecy as God. There was something he knew that none of the other disciples knew, and he told them plainly right there. That's something that Jesus knew as God. And if we were to continue looking at examples of that, we could go to Matthew 9:4, where Jesus is about to heal a paralyzed man, and the Pharisees are saying, what kind of man would heal on the Sabbath? And it says, Jesus, knowing the thoughts in their heart, spoke to them about the evil they had in their heart. Why do you think evil in your heart? Only God can know our thoughts. Jesus, as God, knew what they were thinking. We could continue with other examples where Jesus knew one of his disciples would betray him, and he says so in Mark 14, where Jesus knew that his disciples were arguing about who was the greatest among them. It says Jesus, knowing their thoughts, spoke to them about who should be the greatest and how to behave. When Jesus first met Nathanael, he said, "There's an Israelite in whom there is no falseness, no guile." Nathanael said, "How do you know me?" He says, I knew you when you were under the fig tree. Well, Jesus wasn't there under the fig tree with Nathanael. How do you know that? He says, you must be the Son of God, the kingdom of Israel, because you know something that no other human being could know. And if we needed any other clear proof, it's probably best said in John 2:24, where the crowds wanted to make Jesus king, have him overthrow the Romans, and it says, ooh, what a telling verse. John 2:24, but Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all men. He didn't need man's testimony about man, for he knew what was in a man. Jesus was, is, and always will be God. And these verses, among a dozen, show that Jesus knew things that only God could know about life, about the future, and about our hearts. Jesus clearly was God. But if we continue down, if we continue down in Mark 13:32, Jesus has predicted the destruction of the temple. And his disciples pick up on this, and they began saying, tell us, teacher, when will these things happen? When will these things be? What's the date that all this is going to be destroyed? Because Jesus begins to tell them not just about the temple's destruction that will happen in AD 70, but basically about the end of the age, about the end of the world, when he's going to return. Now, he hasn't even died yet, let alone been resurrected, yet let alone ascended, let alone told them about his coming return. But he tells them about the signs at the end of the age. He predicts what's going to happen shortly before the church gets raptured, and then we have a time of tribulation, 7 years, and then he's going to return. And so he clearly, as God, knows a lot of things. He tells them sign after sign after sign. Signs in the heavens, signs on earth, physical signs, spiritual signs. What's going to happen before he returns? But as to when all these things will be, basically they're saying, what's the timetable? What's the date? Jesus comes down and says, verse 32, but concerning that day or that hour when he physically will return to earth, concerning that day and hour, who knows? They've asked, when's the date? When's it going to be? Who knows? How many know? The Father. No one else knows. The angels in heaven don't know, Jesus says, nor the Son. Jesus is saying of himself, this one who saw Nathanael under the fig tree, who knew the thoughts of men, who could read men's minds and hearts, who spoke prophecy after prophecy, he says, of that day and hour, not even I know. Clearly, Jesus was God, but also clearly, this verse is here to show us that he was also human. He was man. We know he was man because he went to the well, spoke to the woman of the well, and to the cross, and in both cases, he said, can I have some water? I, what? Am thirsty. Right? We know he was human because even after his resurrection, when he was by the seaside in Galilee with the disciples, he cooked and presumably he ate. We know Jesus got tired. We know Jesus was human. Clearly God, but clearly man. And here in this example, he shows his humanity by showing a lack of knowledge. Raise your hand if you're a human being. How can you tell? Raise your hand if you know everything. Raise your hand if your spouse thinks you know everything. Right. But the truth is, as human beings, we don't know everything, do we? And Jesus says, I don't know when I'm coming back. And there was one other example in Luke 8. Remember the woman with the issue of blood? And Jesus is coming along in the crowds, and the woman doesn't say anything to him, but she does what? Reaches out, she touches the hem of his garment, and Jesus stops, and he asks 3 simple words, who touched me? And we know he was more than human, because he then says, I know somebody touched me because I felt what? Healing power go out of me. As God, he had the power to heal where he didn't even need to touch the wood. She could just touch the hem of his garment. So clearly there, in that moment, he's God. He senses healing power goes out of him, but he's also clearly man. The two, because he stops and he says, who touched me? Why? Why do we have this story? Why doesn't Jesus know the day or the hour? Why do we have this? I think that we see the signs and wonders and the miracles. I think that we see in the New Testament Jesus over and over doing miracles, because what really needed to be proven there was that Jesus was God. Right? We know the stories of, this is the carpenter's son. We know his father and his mother. We know what town he comes from. We know his brothers and his sisters. People thought and knew that Jesus was man, that he was human. The miracles are signs to show that Jesus is also God, and that he has the prerogatives of God. Being able to raise from the dead, being able to forgive sins, knowing the things that he knows. Those folks needed to know Jesus wasn't just a man, Jesus was God. But I think sometimes in this day for believers, now not for unbelievers, because unbelievers tend to think Jesus isn't God. They think he's just a good man, a good moral teacher, a nice enough fellow, but certainly not God. But I think for Christians in this day, I think it's important that we get this, even I don't know the day or the hour, that we get the who touched me, so that we will remember that God is also human like me and like you. Because sometimes we can overlook that. In our love and care of Jesus, in our exalting him and worshiping, as we ought to do, sometimes we leave out the, hey, he's human and went through the struggles we go through. Right? When the scripture says there's no temptation that's come to you that hasn't come to every man, guess what it says about Jesus? He himself, as man, was tempted in what ways? In all the ways that we are tempted. May not have been in the exact same situation, but in every way we're tempted. It says, the scripture says, Jesus was tempted. He was clearly man as well as God. And so God puts this in here. Why doesn't Jesus know the date of his return? It's because we need to see him as both God and as man. And this is going to teach us some lessons that are important to us. Now, by the way, just a real quick, I got time to run this rabbit? All right, 30 seconds, I'll run this rabbit. Why does Jesus say the temple's going to be destroyed, and it is by AD 70? Why does he predict that, and it's okay? Why is that okay? Because, and you can read this in Hebrews 9, once Jesus is here, the Jews don't need the temple with its sacrificial system anymore. They still need houses to worship just as we do. But they don't need a central place where sacrifices of sheep and goats and cows are made anymore, because Jesus has now come to be the King. The one sacrifice, how many times? Once and for ever. Once and for all. So now that Jesus is here, they don't need the temple anymore. Jesus says, I'm greater than the temple. But why, when they asked, what's the date or the hour, why does Jesus say, I don't know, and why is that important? First of all, it's to show us Jesus' submission. Philippians 2, 5 through 8 says it this way. You all, Christians, me, have this mind, think this way. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, right? Think like Jesus thinks. Who, although Jesus was in the form of God, he was God, he didn't count equality with God a thing to be grasped and held on to. But instead, what did he do? It says he emptied himself. This is called Jesus' kenosis, from a verb in Greek that means to empty out. This is his kenosis, when he voluntarily renounces or puts aside or lays aside some qualities of God in order to be submissive to the Father and to really know what it's like to be human. Jesus voluntarily emptied himself. Why didn't he know his return? Because he has emptied himself of some knowledge, and the Father chose not to reveal that knowledge to him while he was on earth. Jesus emptied himself, it says in Philippians. He took on the form of a servant. Oh, snap. If our master's acting like a servant and looking after others, what hope is there for us biggity bigs trying to be big shots? Huh? If Jesus, whom we follow as a servant, have this mind in you that Christ also has. Jesus, being found in human form, Philippians tells us, humbled himself by becoming obedient even to the point of death on a cross. So Jesus doesn't know, because of his voluntary self-emptying out of some things that he would know and did know as God. Why? Because Jesus wanted to show us humans that he had to depend on the Father and pray to the Father and listen to the Father and be one with the Father. What did Jesus say? I only do that which pleases the Father. The Father and I are one. How much does Jesus do of his own accord? Nothing. I do nothing, Jesus said, of my own accord, but only what I see the Father doing. Only what the Father tells me to do. Jesus is showing us. Why doesn't he know this? Because he's showing us that as a human, we need to depend on God. And who better to show us the importance of that than the one who voluntarily, who was God, lays that aside and says, I choose not to know the day and the hour when I'll come back. So first, this is showing us Jesus' humility and taking on servanthood. And secondly, Jesus is saying, if I don't know, and it's better that I don't know. Now, by the way, real quick, I think when Jesus got back to heaven, to his full glory in heaven as God, I think he knows now. I think he knows the date now. I think it's on his day planner. I think it's in his Google Calendar that Jesus knows the day and the specific hour and all the circumstances of when he's coming back. He knows it now. But he didn't know it then. And Jesus said, beginning with verse 33, he doesn't tell them when this is all going to happen. He says, here are signs. It's important to know the signs, but I'm not telling you the exact date. In fact, I don't even know. So, verse 33, be on guard. Keep awake, for you don't know when the time will come. Did Jesus know that day when the time would come? Nope. And he said, you guys, you want to know, but I don't know and I can't tell you. You don't know when the day will come. It's like a man going on a journey. When he leaves home and puts his servants in charge, each with his own work, he commands the doorkeeper to stay awake. He says, it's like that. Or, to put it in teen comedy parlance, what are all the teen comedies of the wild party weekends based on? Who's left and gone out of town somewhere? The parents. And what do the teens do? Party on. But with this caveat, they think they know what? When mama and daddy are coming back. What's not just the teen temptation, but the temptation for all of us as humans. Men, your wife is gone for the weekend. When do you make the bed and clean the dishes and straighten up? What? I heard it. Just before she gets back. Is that not our tendency? Kids, your parents are gone and you have to have your room cleaned up. When do you tend to clean it up? Just 5 minutes before they get home, just before they get back. Jesus is saying that's the tendency. And if you knew exactly when all this was going to happen, what would we tend to do? Party. Wait. Not do what we should do. Not be on guard. Not be working for the master. Therefore, Jesus says, stay awake. For you don't know when the master will come. In the evening? Midnight? Or when the rooster crows, or in the morning? How many of you, man, this is just on us. How many of you thought your wife was coming home at this hour, waited to do something, and she ever came home earlier? Never happened? Okay? You're blessed if it hasn't happened. Therefore, stay awake, lest the master come suddenly and find you asleep. And what I say to you, Jesus says, what I say to you, disciples, I say to all. Stay awake. Are you saved? Have you been to Jesus for the cleansing power, been washed in the blood? Are you saved? Do you know? Do you know that you know that you know if you died right now, you'd be in heaven with Jesus? Do you know? For a certainty, do you know? If you don't, wake up. Be awake. Never mind when Jesus is coming back. When might you go to meet him? Christian Mason, your buddy the other night in Atlanta, didn't know, did he? Joe's friend Jake, his wife, passed away just the other day. We don't know. If you're not saved, settle that today. But if you are saved, Christian, stay awake, be working. Because we don't know when Brother Jesus is coming back. But when he does, it's too late to grab the dustpan and the broom then. It's too late to tell your buddy who's unsaved about Jesus then. When he comes back, it's all over but the shouting. And folks, there's not only going to be shouting, There's going to be weeping and wailing. And I don't mean Jennings. And gnashing of teeth. He came to show us that he was God, and he came to show us that he was man. And he came to tell us, if God hasn't revealed that hour yet to me, he surely hasn't revealed it to you. And the reason is, stay awake. Let's stand and sing. Farther and farther away. He's calling today. Right now. And y'all are family to us, right? We love you, and Darryl and Bubba and Kayla and Rachel and I get everybody right? I get everybody? Praise God. Thank you so much for doing this. If you haven't had a chance to shake their hands, please do. Love up on each other. Shake each other's hands, saying, glad you were here today. Father, thank you for sending us Jesus, our brother, the God, clearly God, and the man, clearly man. Two natures, one existence, coming with a message to us to show us how to be a servant and to remind us, stay awake. Because you know God more than we'll ever know, and you depended Jesus.